For the independent project portion of this year's illustration course, I've chosen to write and illustrate on vampires. Vampires are delightful, usually having great screen presence and charisma, as well as a storied history surrounding their mythology, which makes them an especially rich monster to explore. My essay didn't exactly propose a question, but was more so my aim to put together a statement that vampires are an undying concept, and since their inception, we've continued to fall in love with them. To explain this, I started with the mythological aspects, looking briefly from where they came from, but mostly focusing on the media therein in my essay. The way vampires were slowly built up from various ideas originating from Eastern Europe was fascinating to learn about though, as it's a creature that evolved over time, adding things on as different people wrote about them, either from perceived real events or from fiction, and that's something that even continued with film. One of the earliest pieces of vampire fiction which I looked at was John Polidori's The Vampire. Polidori being friends with Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley and Lord Byron, two very prolific authors, Byron specifically being a figure I bring up in my essay as he's entangled with the vampire through the Byronic hero figure he's connected to. He also has an influence inspiring vampiric figures too, so I use this to explain that vampires and the Gothic Wanderer are of the same ilk. They're both outsiders and a stand-in from people who don't fit the norm. Early on, the vampire started as a dark and gloomy, predatory individual, usually male, but the odd female one did exist, like Carmilla. But the idea of the vampire would shift greatly over time, and I believe it's perhaps due to how we use them in media. Vampires are a great way to explore taboo and often sexual ideas. Perhaps subconsciously, even Bram Stoker might have interweaved his thoughts about sexuality into Dracula. We can see this in the character of Lucy Westenra, who wants more than one partner, and Dracula himself is rather domineering and predatory in his pursuit of Wilhelmina. This is especially relevant when we consider the 1993 adaptation by Francis Ford Coppola. There's a raw sexual craving and desire on display, as well as a questioning of the sexual status quo from Lucy. There isn't an exact link here, but Bram Stoker was a friend of Oscar Wilde, who was a homosexual. Due to his actions, he got charged and incarcerated for gross indecency. Being a homosexual was not permissible in the UK at the time, leading to arrests and incarcerations, and it's possible that some frustrations at the current status quo or at Wilde himself made its way into Dracula. Wilde was an interesting character as well. I mentioned the portrait of Dorian Gray in my paper. Although not explicitly a vampire story, Dorian Gray features some homosexual undertones as well as a character who does not age physically and remains beautiful but rotten to its core, so I felt like there was links to vampire stories there, and also the homosexual angle, which is important for my physical part of this project. Some of the links may be tenuous, but I think it's undeniable that a lot of vampires are very fruity in appearance, dressing lavishly, speaking seductively, and they often don't have a preference for who their targets are, men, women, whoever. Many male vampires also look very feminine. I mention Lestat from Interview with a Vampire, played by Tom Cruise, in my paper, as well as Alucard from the newest Castlevania animated series. There's an androgyny and beauty to them that goes against the status quo of what a man is supposed to look like. As humans, we also tend to vilify things we don't like or understand. Homosexuality was one of those things, and perhaps some writers conceptually made homosexuality into a monster by using vampires, or just used vampires to hone in on their feelings surrounding the subject. In modern times, we are much fairer to the vampire. Films like Twilight help domesticate them and bring them to a more modern audience, showing us a different kind of vampire other than Dracula, which people would usually associate with the creature. Sesame Street has Count Von Count, who brought the concept to children, making a more friendly figure, and then there's a whole host of media now where vampires aren't just predatory evil creatures out to suck their blood. This is definitely where I'm drawing from for my project portion of this module, vampires who are safer and embody more human aspects, ones we can relate and empathize with. This is a connection I made in my essay too, that as we've become more progressive and open as a society, vampires have stepped out of their villainous roles more and more. For the practical portion, I wanted to make a comic on vampires, a mix of romance and horror, interweaving some of the ideas I explored while researching vampires. My art style is much more cutesy and cartoony, so portraying vampires as something more gothic and scary wasn't my exact intention at the beginning. Making them more appealing is the route I wanted to go down. I think I also tend to veer more on the feminine side with how I draw characters, which has a lot of people thinking the characters I draw are female when usually I make them male or more androgynous. Like I mentioned previously, a lot of vampires are quite feminine, so I wanted to tap into that a bit, and personally, I like the idea of dismantling the way masculine characters are supposed to look. I'm adapting vampires to suit the kind of story I want to tell. In the story, I depict the vampire boy as a more flirtatious, snarky, and sometimes a little creepy or ethereal in some panels. I wanted to try to make him cute, but still something you should be wary of, but at the same time potentially attractive as most vampires are, not losing the darker edges, but making him more approachable and lovable at a glance. There are also some creepier elements present in these 2 pages of 3x3 panels, which I can only describe as David Lynch inspired. They are a series of fast single images in sequence that display the character's emotional bond growing, as well as some more abstract imagery that builds up the tone of the world a little bit. I thought it might be effective in giving it a bit more substance with the limited page count I set myself, and it helped interweave some darker ideas and set some seeds for later plot events in the chapter. It's quite surface level, but the act of violence portrayed when the human boy enters the store later on and encounters the masked individual is meant to parallel people committing hate crimes. There's a sort of bait if you're paying attention on a news article mentioning vampire crime on the rise, but it's obscured because it's referring to crimes on vampires and not committed by them. In this instance, vampires to me are a stand-in for queer representation, which I think is appropriate considering their history. I'm just adapting them to suit a more modern allegory. It's something that I find quite upsetting, that people can't accept others' love for each other, that they think it's unnatural and want to correct it through violent means. When people don't understand something, they often meet it with hostility, so instead of projecting that fear of homosexuality onto the vampire, like in older iterations of stories, I'm showcasing it openly and depicting the people who want to harm them as the antagonistic force, a sort of reversal of ideas. The vampire isn't a monster in my story. He's kind to the human boy, he loves him, saves him, and does not retaliate with physical violence. He is not wrong for existing or for who he decides to love. As our attitude changes with how we perceive things like queer people, our media should change too, and there's a lot of subtext in vampire media we can draw from and play with to create new stories and adapt the creature with more modern sensibilities, as well as just to create fresher stories with new ideas. I hope I've gotten across how much I love vampires and how great a concept they are for exploring modern social issues. I'm not sure everyone recognizes how deep vampires can be, usually falling back on the stereotypical Dracula image in their minds, but we consistently get new great vampires year after year in our media. I mentioned Call of the Night by Kotoyama in my essay, as well as DRCL Midnight Children, a modern adaptation of Dracula. Both are modern manga, which are really good and fresh takes on what vampire stories can be. And the recent game Baldur's Gate 3, which came out this year, features Astarion, a vampire character who is especially beloved, and their voice actor Neil Newborn just won the Game Award for Best Performance a few days ago, showing they're still very popular. Vampires are a concept that's always relatable and a stand-in for any topic we want to discuss really, and as such, I think they're an idea that will persist in our media until humanity ceases to exist. As always though, thank you for watching, be kind to each other, and take care.